Good evening, everyone. My name is Brittany Kerfoot. I'm the Deputy Director of Events at Politics and Prose, and I'd like to welcome all of you to PNP Live. We are presenting this event in partnership with our friends at Girls Night In, a self-care community that believes in cultivating friendships to deepen personal wellness. The Vanishing half is actually Girls Night In's July book club pick, so be sure to read along with them next month and check out their website, which is girlsnightinclub.com, for more details on that. At any time tonight, you can click on the green button below to purchase tonight's book straight from PNP's website. And a reminder that we're offering $5 shipping flat rate, so no matter what you add to your cart, you'll pay the same shipping price. You can also ask either of our speakers a question by clicking on Ask a Question down at the bottom of your screen. And you can also read other people's questions and then vote on the ones that you would like to see answered the most. Finally, and most importantly, as tonight's speakers both live in the Crown Heights neighborhood of Brooklyn, they would like to urge you to donate to the Crown Heights Mutual Aid Fund, which is a network designed to help us support one another and the most vulnerable in the community in the face of this pandemic. If you're able to contribute, I've popped the link into the chat, and I will post it again at least one more time before the event ends if you lose it. So please consider donating. Any amount truly does help. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. First, Brit Bennett is the author of the New York Times-bestselling novel, The Mothers, and now The Vanishing Half, a story about identical twin sisters who at age 16 run away from their small, Black 1950s Southern town and take very different paths in life. Moderating tonight's conversation is Jazmine Hughes, a story editor for the New York Times Magazine and co-creator of Writers of Color, a database to help assigning editors discover more diverse writers. So now please help me welcoming Brit and Jazmine to PNP Live.
Oh. I feel like the Brady Bunch or something. Hello, everyone. Hello, Brit.
Hi, Jazmine. Hi, everyone.
Hi, all you beautiful people. Thank you so much for joining Brit and I tonight in this conversation. Brit, and I'm really happy to talk to you all the time, but I think that it is especially resonant to me to talk on this week when, you know, people are marching in the streets and protesting against police brutality, and I'm glad that we get to share this space together. So thank you.
Me too. Thank you for being here.
On that note, in 2014, you published a little story in Jezebel called I Don't Know What to Do with Good White People. And I was reading the story about you in Vogue after The Mothers came out. And you mentioned, or rather you very forcefully said that it's not your job to explain Black pain to white people. So how's your week been?
Yeah, I think it's been a surreal week in a lot of ways. You know, I think about this pandemic that we're living through. And then to think about this pandemic that has had, you know, disproportionate racial effects. And then thinking about that alongside the public health crisis that is police violence. So to see all of these kind of narratives converging during this week in which I released a book that was in part about racism and the formation of racial identity, you know, racialized violence. It's been very surreal, to say the least.
Yeah. I mean, this is kind of a silly question, but I feel like I ask every author I talk to. How do you write a book? How did you come up with this idea, and how long did it take you to work on this?
Yeah, it took probably about 4 or 5 years. The idea came from a conversation I had with my mom, where she mentioned this town that she remembered from her childhood in Louisiana, where everyone kind of intermarried so that their children would get progressively lighter in different generations. And she sort of said this to me offhandedly on the phone, and it struck me as so strange and specific and disturbing. And I started to think about what it would be like to actually live in a town like that, where colorism is not just, something that's an individual bias or something that's even like a sociological bias, but something that is kind of institutionalized within the place that you live.
So there are so many like pre-existing cultural texts that I thought of when I was reading this book, like Passing by Nella Larson, Caucasia by Dancy Senna. But like the thing that was sort of stuck in my craw is this Chris Rock joke. He's basically says, I feel like I sound like Michael Scott in The Office being like, here's a Chris Rock scene. But he basically says that there's no white person in America would ever want to trade places with a black person, right? He's like, people don't even want to trade places with me, and I'm rich. And I just kept returning to it and reading the book. So I wonder what sources of inspiration did you have when you were trying to talk about like the duality of race? And I have a follow-up to that, but it just went away. So I'm gonna let you answer that part first.
I mean, yeah, I actually thought about that Chris Rock kind of joke too. I mean, at least one of the jokes he makes about the idea of, him being this rich black celebrity and like, living in neighborhoods with like white dentists or like people who are like other middle-class white professions, and him having to be this kind of exemplary celebrity to buy his way into those neighborhoods. That was something that I thought about for the storyline, the book that's about this black family trying to integrate this white neighborhood. And they truly have to be these like exceptional black people to try to move into this neighborhood. But, I think I read a lot of different things. I read this book by Allison Hobbs called A Chosen Exile, which is kind of a historical text about the history of passing. She says something in the book about the idea that we often conceptualize passing as being kind of about opportunism and thinking about it being about, what does somebody try to gain in pretending to be white? When in fact, what she was really interested in is what people lose by doing that. And I think that was really foundational for me in thinking about this character, Stella, who ends up losing a lot when she passes for white. She loses her connection to her family, her past, her sister, who's the closest person to her in this world. So I think that was a really important text. There were some of those fictional texts that you point out, like Nella Larson's Passing, which is a book that I read in college and really loved, and I think holds up really well. So that was a book that I thought about a lot also.
I feel like I'm worried that we might have jumped in too quickly just because I'm so excited to talk to you about this book, which everyone's going to buy. But do you want to take a step back and just talk about what the book is broadly about for people who maybe don't know too much about it?
I would love to. Thank you, Jazmine. So yeah, The Vanishing Half is a story about these twin sisters, Desiree and Stella, who are identical twins. They grow up in this very small, insular Louisiana town where everyone is really invested in the idea of light skin being better than dark skin. And throughout a series of events, their lives kind of splinter in these really irreparable directions. Stella decides to live as a white woman, and Desiree returns to this town with her dark-skinned daughter and lives as a black woman.
Something that I know about you that I also kept thinking about is your MFA, right? And I feel as if there are a lot of themes in the book that are like so neatly written out that I was just like, oh my God, I wish I could grade this or I could edit this or something. But obviously there's a tremendous theme of duality, which comes up with Desiree and Stella, of course, but also it comes up with a more minor character, Benny and Bianca, right? The character of Reese. How did you, I guess like once you decided that you wanted to write about passing and that you wanted to build out this theme of duality, how did you come up with all the supporting characters to I guess, bleed that out as well?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I knew originally I wanted to play with this idea of twins. I think twins are a really natural way of kind of playing with this question about identity, because these are characters who so share this, genetics, and they share this upbringing, but they end up being two completely separate people. So I knew I was going to have the twins at the center of it. Then I became interested in their children as I went by. So I started to think about how their daughters would be so different from each other. They've grown up under completely different circumstances, as far as race and class and region and all these things. So I started to think about that. And then I think there were these other characters that kind of emerged as I started to flesh out their worlds. And I started to think about, other forms of playing with identity, whether it's acting or it's, this idea of photography. There are these other kind of forms of where characters are kind of trying to parse through these questions of identity and pretense, authenticity. All of these things are kind of swirling around. So I kind of backed my way into a lot of these other minor characters. That's a long way of saying that, once I had the twins kind of at the center of it, I sort of backed my way into these other characters that populate the world.
And I don't know if you remember this, but after I read The Mothers, so guys, I read The Mothers when it came out. I was on vacation and I was like, oh, my friend Brit wrote a book. It's going to be fun. I'm going to bring with me on vacation and I'm going to have a laugh. And then I texted you. I was like, what the fuck? I was like, why am I crying? I hate this. Which is to say that I find your novels and your fiction to be so arresting. One thing that you're really good at is world building. And there are all these little details, whether it's about like the profession that one of the characters picks up later in the book, or just like the details of the town, the details of college classes and things that are in the syllabus that were all so refined and just immediately plunged me into the book. What's your research process like for something like this?
Yeah, it was very different than The Mothers. The Mothers was really kind of based on the town that I grew up in, and so I didn't do a whole lot of research there. I just kind of, wrote towards memory in a lot of ways. But I think this book, it did require a different type of research. I think there was some nonfiction that I read. I read nonfiction like, JSTOR articles about these types of towns that I was writing towards, were these very insular Creole communities. So I did some research there. I did other kind of reading about, twins. One form of research that was actually weirdly helpful to me was about faking your death, which was something I didn't know anything about. But I started to think about passing as a type of death faking in a way. What does it mean to kind of end the life that you had, start a new one? What happens to the people you left behind? How do you really commit to this new life? Mm-hmm. So for me, reading this book about faking your death was a way that made passing really, emotionally real for me. Mm-hmm. Because it wasn't just a question of, are you trying to avoid being Black? Do you want to be white? It wasn't that question anymore. For me, it was more like, what would it take for you to leave your family behind and never talk to them again? And as a person who's pretty close to her family, that was, really unthinkable for me. So I had to kind of do a lot of this reading to try to put myself in that emotional space.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Even more so because like that's the question that the character is grappling with, right? It's never like, I want to be white, period, end of sentence, I'm leaving this all behind. It's just a back and forth. Just in case someone like wanted to fake their own death, not me, but somebody who's maybe watching this, is there anything from that book that sort of rocked your world that when you read it that you can share with us?
I mean, a lot. One was just like the reasons why people fake their deaths. So perhaps depressingly and perhaps unsurprisingly, it's different for men and women generally. For men, it's typically they're trying to avoid some type of debt. For women, it's generally they're trying to avoid a man, and that's why they're doing it. So that was interesting. And, what became really interesting to me was these people who get caught like years later, mm-hmm. and who have, become so sort of wrapped up in this new life that they've created for themselves, that they kind of insist that was who they were. Like, no, this is who I am now. I'm not pretending this is who I am. So that was something that was really interesting. That book was different because it was, a lot of it was about like shedding your digital footprint, which, you know, as someone who is unfortunately quite online, that is very difficult for me to do at this point. I imagine also probably you, Jazmine.
What, me? No.
So it would be difficult for us probably to fake our deaths. But that was part of the story, which is different. My book took place in like this pre-internet space, but to me, it was that emotional resonance of what does it mean to kind of leave your past behind, and what does it mean to commit to a new life?
So if I delete my Instagram later tonight, everybody, it's just a coincidence. Let's get right into it.
There you go.
How did you decide to set the novel in? I mean, it's set in so many places, but one of like the many dualities is the shift in time. So how did you decide on the particular decades and where the story would take place geographically?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it was sort of a personal connection to this era because my mom went to Washington, D.C. from Louisiana, and she arrived the week that Dr. King was assassinated. So the idea of my mom, like, you know, kind of arriving into history from her small town, that was always something that was very resonant with me in thinking about her life and her journey. So I loved the idea of setting the novel kind of during this period of unrest and during this period of shifts happening around race. You know, the idea of these, particularly Stella, having to learn how to perform whiteness at a time in which the scripts for whiteness are being, you know, not changed, but they're being challenged. So she's always kind of doing it wrong. So that was something that was interesting to me. She comes from this, like, you know, small town in the middle of Louisiana during the Jim Crow era, and then she's has to adjust to this new performance of whiteness and can't really do it right. So there's something interesting to me about that kind of civil rights era, post-civil rights era. Most of our really famous passing stories are set far before that. You know, you were talking about Nella Larson. It's kind of associated with like the Harlem Renaissance and like you know, 20s, 30s, 40s. So the idea of setting the story a little bit later was interesting to me for, I think, some of those reasons.
One of the really incredible things that I was struck by in reading is that you were able to arbitrate what whiteness means. And you were like able to assign different like characteristics that whether you meant to or not, like it carried some inherently moral value, right? So at one point you described that whiteness is missing something, like missing a sense of shame that one of the characters had previously had when she was identifying as and being read as Black. And then at another point, you say that there's nothing to whiteness except for boldness. So I wonder, how did you conceptualize like the delineation between how it meant to perform whiteness and how it meant to perform Blackness?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Girl, I'm a journalist. Just kidding.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I was interested in is the idea of this character, you know, committing to whiteness as this act, and the idea that race can be performed, but at the same time, it has these real implications in your life. So, you know, this idea of this character becoming white because she has walked into this building and said that she's white, and that is the formation that makes her white. You know, so I think that was something that I was kind of interested in, the idea that, you know, we have these hierarchies that are set around these categories, but those categories themselves are so flimsy. You know, so I wanted to think about how these characters can challenge those hierarchies and transgress them. But at the same time, those hierarchies still affect them. You know, they affect them in material ways in their lives. So for me, it was kind of that tension between those space that was interesting. And even just taking a step back and thinking about what is whiteness? What does it mean to be white? You know, thinking about that in this way, I think was fun for me to kind of imagine.
You've mentioned a couple of times now that you're very close to your family and you talk to your family about your work. Do you consider those conversations with your family research? And I'm curious about like how your family or conversations with them plays into your writing process.
I don't know that I think about it as research, but I do find it really informative. I think I'm always, maybe not always, but I think often writing toward my family. Constantly thinking about these family stories. In this book, I had my mom's story coming from Louisiana. My dad grew up in, South Central LA. So he was kind of like a college-age student in LA around the time that parts of the books are set. So I think that I'm always kind of writing towards them in a way. I try not to write anything too personal or anything that they would object to. But at the same time, I think that, I find that informative, the way of thinking about my parents' story and my family's story and how that fits in within these historical narratives. There's a way in which I find something really generative by thinking about that.
Would you say, do you have an ideal reader is my question. And would that be your parents? Do you like write towards a particular person or envision a particular person reading your book when you're writing?
I don't know if I do. Definitely not my parents, if it was. I don't like to think about my parents reading my book. That's a nightmare. But, I think that my imagined reader, I think, are Black women readers. I think that that's always been the community that I've seen myself writing about and writing to and writing with. I think about the writers who mean a lot to me, who were mostly Black women writers.
Can you give us some examples?
I can give you some examples. I think there were the obvious people like Toni Morrison, like Jesmyn Ward. I think about some of my friends and writers that I really love, like Angela Flournoy, Y.A. Moore. She had a book that just came out this past Tuesday. It's great. I think about, I think when I was in my MFA program, I had a professor ask me once, who do you imagine your audience to be? And nobody had ever asked me that before. And it was funny because, we had that question kind of raised for the workshop. And a lot of the white guys in the workshop were like, everybody, that is my audience. And I would have never said that. I was just like, oh yeah, it's Black women. That's who I'm writing toward. And obviously it's great when people who are outside of that group like your work. But I think of those being Alice Walker and all of these Black women writers that I read when I was younger and I continue to read. I think of those as being the members of my community and the people that I'm writing about and writing to.
Does that sentiment extend to your nonfiction, which I know you don't write nearly as often, but do you feel the same way about essays? I say that. I say she doesn't write that nearly as often. You guys, because I want her to write it for me.
I know. That's why I'm just laughing. I don't know. I think nonfiction feels different as far as audience. At least my experience in nonfiction, they've been, these pieces that I've written usually quicker than the 4 to 5 years it takes me to write a novel. There's a feeling of getting the feedback really quickly. There's just kind of a different experience for me of publishing nonfiction than it has been publishing fiction. So, I don't know that I imagine a nonfiction audience. It is something that I write quite rarely, as you said. So I guess I don't think of it as much as the true kind of drudgery and labor of love that a novel often is, because it just takes so much time and it takes so much out of you.
When did you realize that you wanted to be a writer?
I think probably it was, I don't know, maybe elementary school, middle school. I was pretty young, I think. I remember, I think the book that made me really want to be a writer was The Outsiders.
Really? By S.E. Hinton?
By S.E. Hinton.
Oh my God, girl, I hated that book. We had to read in 7th grade, and I was like Like, forget Tony Boy, I hate him. Okay.
It's really funny to think about because it's the type of book that like I would never read now, you know, like these like young white boys having like capers, you know, but it was a book that I had like a teacher who gave that book to me. And it was probably one of the first novels I read. I think I was, I don't know, third or fourth grade. It was pretty young. But, you know, that was a story that I remember being so immersed in. And I like recently saw a picture of the copy that I had, which was like this broken, cracked paper book of that book. So I'm like, yeah, I did really love that book. I didn't imagine that. You know, so I think that was really the first book that was like, oh, I want to do that. I want to tell a story.
Is there a book that you've read more recently that you've envied, that you wish you had written?
Ooh. That's tough. I think there are books that I admire a lot from them. You know, I read this book called Actress by Anne Enright that just came out. And it's a book that's about fame and intimacy and family and complicated mother-daughter relationships. And I really loved a lot that book did. But at the same time, you know, it's a book about this daughter of like an Irish theater legend. So it's not a book I could have ever written. But I admired a lot that book did. And I think it spoke to thematics that I'm really interested in. But as far as a book that I wish I'd written, it's so hard to think about that for me because these books feel so intricately tied to whoever wrote them. Yeah.
That was another thing I wanted to ask you about. Like, it's very clear that you're interested in relationships or dynamics between women.
Yeah.
Do you have sisters? Do you have siblings?
I do have 2 older sisters.
Okay. Does your relationship with them play into how you write about women or your relationship with your mother? As someone with 4 sisters, I always want to read about how sisters interact with each other. And this was like an incredibly heartbreaking, but very good depiction of that.
Thank you. You know, I think so. I think that the closeness of my relationship with my sisters made the relationship between Stella and Desiree have real emotional stakes. Because again, I kept thinking like, what would be the factors in my life that would cause me to choose to never speak to my sisters again? And that's such an impossible thing for me to imagine. So the idea of this character doing that, it really gave it weight, gave it emotional weight. And I don't know that I would have felt that in the same way if I didn't have sisters.
Yeah. Just to go back to books and authors and things, another, I guess, line that stuck out to me from the Vogue story was about how the mother seemed to be influenced by James Baldwin. And I only say seems to be because I wasn't sure if that was the writer's thinking or yours. Mm-hmm. And then obviously when I was reading The Vanishing Half, like the bluest eye just jumped out to me. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about James Baldwin and Toni Morrison and what they have meant to you.
Yeah. You know, I think those are 2 of my favorite authors, and it feels so basic to say that because who doesn't love both of those people? You know, The Bluest Eye was the first Toni Morrison novel I ever read. It was on my parents' bookshelf, and I read it. I was pretty young. I think it was probably a little bit too young to really get the book. But, you know, that was a book that I just remember just the beauty of the language, the power of that story. And also like encountering her work in the way that I think that Toni Morrison was one of the first Black women I kind of saw as being pretty universally lauded at that point as a genius. And I don't know that I ever saw that sort of before Toni Morrison or even really thought about the idea of that. So both the power of her work and also kind of the universal regard for her work, I think was really important for me when I was young. And I think as far as Baldwin goes, I think perhaps, I don't know. I don't know if this is like a common opinion, but actually I really like his fiction. I think a lot more than I actually like his nonfiction. I think that people are really seems more into his nonfiction these days. but I really love Baldwin storyteller and Baldwin the novelist. And, I think about Go Tell on the Mountain, which again was a book that I stole from my parents' bookshelf. And it was a book that was like, there's just a density, like there's a heaviness to that book. And often to a lot of his work, I think about something like Another Country, which is a book that took me a couple attempts to read, because the first time I was like, this is too depressing. I need to come back to this later. But I think that there is a heaviness to that work, but there's also just so much care when it comes to the language that I really admire. The sentences I admire from both of those artists. I think Baldwin also just, again, like I said, the nonfiction, being able to do both. Not everybody can do both, writing fiction, writing nonfiction, writing screenplays, writing criticism. There was so much that both of those writers gave us. So I'm really grateful to be able to have read it. And, it's an honor to hear people see kind of, reverberations between those writers' work and mine.
I mean, I just feel like that's the best thing about Toni Morrison, especially, is that everybody has a story about their first Toni Morrison book.
Sure.
And mine was also The Bluest Eye. And I think I read it in 9th grade English class, Mrs. Henderson, first Black English teacher. I was like, whoa. Okay. And then my mind was sort of blown, but I was also maybe a little too young to understand it. And then years later, I was living in Brooklyn with my white boyfriend, who was an aspiring novelist, and he read it and he like threw it across the room like Sonia Sanchez did talks about in the Toni Morrison documentary, because he was like, why would I try to be a writer after this? Like, what's even the point? And I was like, oh, maybe he's a good one. Like, maybe he gets it. And then it turns out, I'm lesbian, and he didn't stick around anyway. But I love that everybody has that sort of shared experience. And I love even more that you stole so many books from your parents' bookshelves. Do you remember anything else that you took from them?
Oh, those are the two that I remember. Like, I remember the way the cover looked. Like, I kind of remember the edition, like these paperback editions that they had. I remember that. My dad my dad doesn't really read a whole lot of fiction. My mom is really the person who turned me into a reader. But he just had like a lot of these, like, I think about like I Am the Darker Brother, the edition of that anthology that we had on the bookshelf. A lot of these different books that I stole from my parents. Because my parents, fortunately, did not really care what I read. They didn't like monitor it or worry that it was going to be age inappropriate or anything, hence me reading The Bluest Eye at such a young age. But, I was grateful for that. That reading was a place of freedom and exploration. And even when you encounter something that you're not ready for, if you're lucky, it'll find you again at the right time.
Okay, this is going to be my last question for you, and then I hope people are asking questions in the question thingy. I don't know how computers work. But what do you want people to take away from this book when they're done with it?
I hope that, first, I just hope that people enjoy reading it. I think that
I did. It's good. You should buy it.
Thank you, Jazmine. Obviously there is so much happening right now. We've experienced this really traumatic pandemic. We're experiencing this trauma of police violence and have been. So there's so much that is just hard right now. So I hope that the book gives you a bit of an escape. I hope that it's a story that, resonates with you emotionally, and that gives you, some sense of joy in spite of this. But I hope also that it just helps you think about identity and sort of those questions that I was kind of interested in of sort of what makes us who we are. And, this idea that these categories that we sometimes want to think about as being really fixed or clear are not. They're flexible, and all of our identities are often fluid and in tension with each other. And that's kind of what it means to be alive. So I hope that people walk away with maybe a more complex idea about their own identity, or just these kind of topics of identity, if they're not as concrete and fixed as we have been told that they are.
Well, thank you, Brent. I'm going to go to the questions now. First question from Joy. Did the success of The Mothers impact your writing or writing process?
I
talked about a successful book.
I think that I was lucky that I started writing The Vanishing Half before The Mothers came out. So I had the idea for it. And I think that was really good because I wasn't like having to start from scratch in the wake of this experience. It ended up being a bit of a whirlwind. It ended up being a little bit crazy. So I was lucky for that, I think. But, I think second books are kind of hard because you have this thing that you have just done. And if you're lucky and people like it, then you have that feeling of like, okay, I don't want to disappoint those people who liked The Mothers. But I also knew that I didn't want to write The Mothers again. I wanted to write something that was going to be different, that was going to be bigger, that was going to be a bit more complicated, and take on different places and times and different characters and all these things. So I was kind of in that tension between those two possibilities. And I do think that is something that did apply some pressure on me. But at the same time, I think the process is always kind of the same. Every time you're sitting down with the blank page, it doesn't matter what has happened before it. It doesn't matter who liked the thing you've already written. You're facing the blank page again. And it's hard regardless of, how successful or unsuccessful you've been in the past. So I think for me, it was really just a process of having to learn how to trust myself and try not to be too self-conscious, trying to just accept that I was doing something new. I had never written a second novel before. And I had a friend who told that to me at one point. He was just like, this is the first time you've written a second novel. So even though I'd written a novel before, I had never done it again. And that was a new experience. And that was something I was going to have to learn how to do. So I had to just kind of get to a place of accepting that. And then I think the writing process was pretty much the same. Thank you.
To that point, Nancy says, I'm a debut author with a novel releasing in April, and I'm wondering what you know now about publishing your second book that you wish you had known before.
It's hard to say because this book just came out. It just came out on Tuesday, so I don't know that I am any wiser than I was a week ago. But I think that the advice that I received from a friend who published his second novel earlier this year, was he told me going into it, learning how to only worry about the things that you can control. And I think that that's something that has become very evident as far as living through this pandemic, let alone publishing in the pandemic. I think all of us have seen, our idea of control just being eroded. So I think that that's something that I wish I had done the first time around. I wish I had worried less. I wish that I had understood that once you write the book and once you send it off, it's out of your hands. And after that, it kind of takes on a life of its own. It becomes something completely different. And hopefully people love it and they respond to it, but you can't control whether people love it, whether they read it, whether they buy it, how they read it. You can't control any of that. So I think that maybe a combination of second book and also pandemic has really sort of, hammered that point home to me. And I want to move forward, like really thinking about that in my writing life, but also just my life of learning how to only think about things that I can control.
Just going back to the first question that you answered, I'm going to jump on the question, which is, do you have a writing process? Or what is your writing process? Like in the way, that Tony wrote longhand on like the yellow legal pads, how do you set up and get into that space?
Yeah, mine is not that cool. I think about like people who write, like have typewriters or write like by longhand. And I'm just like, no, I need like a million windows open. I need to be able to like drag things. And I have like a very, unfortunately like 21st century like approach to it. I think for me, I'm a morning writer. I am pretty brain dead after a certain hour. So I really have to kind of get up early and write then. I think the only thing that's maybe really particular with my process is when I'm writing a revision, I have to start with a blank page and type everything out.
I do the same thing.
Yeah. So I can't do any copy and paste. I feel like you have to hear the voice, you have to hear the voice as you're writing it back out. So that gets tedious. But for me, that's really vital, of just hearing the voice and not feeling locked into what you have previously done. I think the idea of having to repeat the language is really important. So I think those are things that are important for me. But I think, I think my process of a writer has been like learning what works for me and learning, I have friends that like can write in bars, and I'm just like, I used to be so envious. I'm like, I wish I have to be like, maybe in a coffee shop, probably by myself, probably with headphones on. Like, I wish I had like a fun way that I could actually get work done. But for me, it's fairly boring. I just need to kind of have a space that's pretty quiet, or have music that I'm listening to or something like that.
Or my way is Adderall, but we can talk about that later. Sarah asks, how do you come up with your character names? I loved all the names in The Vanishing Half, which is a great question. I was wondering the same thing.
Thank you. It depends. Sometimes I just know. I don't remember how I came up with Desiree and Stella, to be honest. I found a note on my phone that had those names pretty early on. So I don't actually have a cool story for that. But some names that come to me pretty early. Other times I'm like, okay, I have to come up with a name for this person. So I go to the like Social Security website where you can look up the most popular name by year. So that can be really helpful if you're writing something like this that was set in the past and you're like, what was the most popular name in 1950? And you can look it up by gender or whatever. You can see names that are more popular, less popular. So that's like a nerdy thing, but can be really helpful of finding names that are like era appropriate. So sometimes I do that for some of the names of the characters. I mostly just try not to have names that like have a lot of the same letters, so people get confused of like, names that are like Beth and Barbara and whatever, things like that. So try to avoid that. But yeah, I think sometimes you're really lucky and the name comes to you really early and it feels really intrinsically part of the character. Other times I have to do a little bit of kind of nerdy work to get there. Yeah, thank you.
I have another question, which is that you are working on a film adaptation of The Mothers, right?
Yes.
How's that go? I'm like stepping very carefully. How's that going? What can you share with us?
All I can say, I wrote a screenplay. I wrote a draft of a screenplay for the adaptation, and I cannot tell you anything beyond that because I don't know. So it's kind of up to the adaptation gods at this point. And from what I know, nothing is being greenlit right now because of the coronavirus. So I don't know what's happening in that direction. But I wrote the draft for the screenplay. It was really hard. And it made me appreciate the world of novels where I feel much more comfortable than the world of film. But at the same time, it was a good experience. I was glad I was able to try to do something I'd never done before. So we'll see. I hope that everything ends up working out once, I guess, Hollywood returns. I don't know when that's going to be or what that will look like, but we'll see.
Do you think, so when did you work on the screenplay versus work on The Vanishing Half? Was that happening at the same time?
Yeah, it was happening at the same time. And I think I knew that I really wanted to work on The Vanishing Half because I kept thinking about it when I was working on this screenplay. That was the thing that I really wanted to get back to working on. And I think it was kind of in between drafts. Like I had a draft done. I was kind of taking time away from The Vanishing Half and I was working on the screenplay. But I kept thinking about the character and the books, and that was really the project that was kind of pulling me away from this other project that I was supposed to be working on at the time. So it ended up being sort of a concurrent project, but yeah, required two very different things from you versus an adaptation of something you've already done in a book that was completely new.
Do you think it had an effect on the way you wrote The Vanishing Half? Because it's interesting to hear you say that, because there were some scenes that really felt like scenes like not commercial break, but like fade to black, open up somewhere else, right? Like it felt very telegenic.
I think that it could be. Honestly, I have never thought about that. But I do think that there are aspects that are probably cinematic. And there were also just kind of tricks that I picked up, I think, about writing from working on the screenplay of ways to be efficient in a scene, ways to be efficient with dialogue. I think there were some film things that I picked up on that translate well into fiction, or at least I hope they translate well into fiction, that were different in the way that I thought about fiction, because you just have to be so economical with the screenplay. You can't drag. You have to just have those moments of breaking, as you were saying. I think that there probably were some ways in which that taught me or molded me as I was working on this novel. I think that's a really great observation.
We're also running low on questions. I have a million, so I'm going to keep going with them. But listeners, if you do have more questions, please feel free to jump into the question thingy. One thing that I noticed, like one of the more resonant themes I noticed is this idea of guilt as a catalyst. And I don't know if I was like projecting my Christian upbringing into that. I was wondering if that was intentional. And like when you think about giving a character motivation, is guilt one of the things that occurs to you?
I mean, I think it's interesting. So, you know, I grew up Catholic, so I don't know if that also is something that is filtered.
It definitely is.
But you know, I think guilt is an interesting emotion because I think in some ways it can be a catalyst for why characters do what they do. In a lot of other ways, I think it is the most like inert emotion and like the most sort of narratively useless emotion. I think that guilt often can kind of feed on itself. So it just becomes this like internal swirling of feeding itself versus actually inspiring you to do anything. So I think, you know, in the case of Stella, this character who passes, I think this is a person who feels a lot of guilt. She feels guilt for leaving her family behind, leaving her sister behind. She feels guilt for lying to all the people in her current life. But insofar as like what it actually helps her do with that guilt, you know, I don't know. I don't know that it actually helps her do anything. I think it's something that kind of she feeds on and that swirls around inside of her in that way. So I think that I was kind of interested in some of these like sort of inert emotions. So like even the idea of shame, like shame is kind of an inert emotion too that can